The rise of urbanization has created a competition between rapid landscape development and the protection of natural resources. As a result of habitat fragmentation, an increasing amount of pressure has been placed upon the conservation of degrading species of both plants and animals. According to Jenkins, the U.S. has directed conservation efforts around protecting specific species rather than targeting the most vulnerable areas. One factor that might influence this vulnerability is small geographic range and spatial distribution. In addition to geographic priorities, Jenkins also describes political, economic, and social patterns to consider before placing focus points for conservation. In Jesse Greenspan's article, Conservation Mismatch, he explains that preservation of biodiversity hotspots could make a huge difference considering there's currently a very small percentage protected. Explaining that originally protected lands were intended to safeguard landscapes such as the Grand Canyon, rather than biodiversity. When analyzing the maps of both currently protected species and biodiversity hotspots, you notice there is a mismatch. A possible solution for this could be placing greater priority upon hotspots for vulnerable species and redirecting some of the resources for national parks. The intended goal of this research is to locate where conservation efforts will affect the most change and show that there is a mismatch between priorities and the currently protected areas. To find insight using GIS, I used a raster to calculate the hotspots of endangered amphibians, birds, mammals, and trees. The output of my model produced a biodiversity hotspot map that outlines the areas in the southeast. This is a product of combining the maps of all 4 tested variables. As you can see, the highest priority for conservation is in the southeast, where all 4 have vulnerable areas. After gaining this insight, I wanted to compare this map with one that shows where protected lands are the most dense within the United States. As you can see, there are the most in the west and southwest. The intention behind the protection of these areas is presumably to maintain natural landscapes, which, in my opinion, are the farthest from nature in a sense that they are heavily managed and maintained. In an article titled 6 Common Mistakes in Conservation Priority Setting, author Edward Game explains the main failure in conservation efforts is not communicating information on priorities in a clear and concise way that helps people understand the reason for conservation in specific locations. Another mistake has been the lack of clear objectives in order to effectively use resources, and there needs to be a well-defined set of actions pertaining to specific goals. Because these issues are complex, they should involve close partnership with communities and organizations to influence these decisions around prioritizing. Game argues that before directing resources at certain species or locations, they should be directed at action, meaning the best conservation plans will use resource allocation to consider what will be effective and what solutions are best for specific species, habitat, or locations. Analyzing the costs and benefits of actions takes a lot deeper consideration than simple prioritization of locations and species, but is an essential part of effective conservation. Another area for improvement within conservation is acknowledgement of risk and likelihood of success. Although assessing this risk may lessen the desire to act upon certain plans, it's important to analyze probability to reach a more logical reasoning for conservation plans. Because conservation requires resources, it's also important to acknowledge the need for public confidence in these plans. There is a need for conservation planners to focus on both community engagement and development of public land and green space in urban areas.